Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, and experience from hundreds of successful role models from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Hayley Evans. Hayley, welcome to the program.
Hello, Fritz. It's lovely to see you, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Allow me to introduce you in a couple of words to the audience, and then we'll explore your background. Co-founder of Waves Tech Ventures, co-founder Women Making Waves. You're also the former CEO of Surge, a digital strategy and consultancy company, which we'll discuss. And you're a director of KGE Mines Rescue. You're also the finalist of the 2022 CEO Global Magazine Entrepreneur of the Year. And you're based out of Sydney. So again, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, I've got a bit of a mixed bag in there, don't I?
Yes, so we're going to explore that a bit. And I must confess, when I tried to do my research on your background, I found it's actually quite difficult to identify who you could say the right Hayley Evans is out there. I realized that's a much more common name than I thought it would. How often do you bump into another Hayley Evans?
So I don't bump into them, but funny story, Fritz, and I'll give the PG rated version of it. The very first time that I Googled my name, so when Google was there and I was young, I was in my teenage years, not to give away my age, but I actually Googled Hayley Evans because I was like, oh, let's see what comes up. And the only hit that came up at the time was an adult entertainer out of the UK with some very explicit photos. So as a 13-year-old or 14-year-old, I was like, I probably should maybe work on that brand a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what is your brand? How would you introduce yourself when you meet somebody for the first time?
Yeah. So what a great question. So I think my brand, like everyone's, has really evolved and come full circle. And I think that comes with age, wisdom, and experience. And I think I can now, in my mid-40s, now really comfortably and profoundly say who I am as a human and as a leader and what I stand for. And I think that the way that I describe myself is a deeply curious, highly energetic and excitable human being that fundamentally really loves solving problems. And I know that can sometimes sound a little cliched, but ever since I was a kid, I was always so curious about people watching and understanding the dynamics of human interaction. And I can actually say that I think probably more subconsciously than strategically and consciously, I've built my entire career around that. You know, if you look at my LinkedIn, often I get asked questions within interviews that says, you know, you have a lot going on there. You have a lot of different industries. You have a number of different experiences that don't make sense. And I'm like, you know, I can totally get that. But fundamentally, Fritz, you know, I'm in the business of people. And whether that applies to the mining sector or whether that applies to the emerging tech center, fundamentally, I love to solve problems for people. And really from a fairness scale, I think I came from a beautiful, loving, amazing upbringing, but a very moderate and blue collar, poorer community. And so I've made it my mission in everything that I do that I really lean into thinking about how do we even the playing field in whatever way I can.
What you described to me is something I come across so often, in the sense that the outside world doesn't have a clue what somebody's doing because it's such a big, broad mix and diverse mix of activities, but the individual themselves sees a very straight, strong line and relationship with everything somebody does.
Yeah. You know, it's a great point too, because one of the things that I always, and I'm privileged to sit on a number of the YPO boards and being involved within the YPO community for the last 8 years now.
You do not know what YPO? What's YPO?
Oh, so YPO is the Young Professionals Organization. It is a peer-to-peer leadership organization of about 33,000 business leaders across the world. So the metrics are you need to hold the position of a chairperson, a CEO, managing director, you need to have 50 plus staff, a certain revenue target, and be under 45 years old at joining. And it's really around coming together and creating a network and people who you can lean onto. And why I loved the question, or what the statement you just made, Fritz, is I always say about YPO and even about leadership roles, being a CEO or a leader of a business is really lonely. And what I mean by that is everyone comes to you for the answers. Everyone wants to know what the next step is. And most of the time, we're winging it. We've got no bloody clue, you know, and I say that very frivolously. There should be some basis of capability. But we're all human, right? And there's an enormous amount of pressure to have that optic where you're supposed to know it all. And what I love about YPO is it's a really safe environment, because you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. Do you?
Yeah. Okay. Hey, let's start with the beginning, because we've explored a little bit what you're doing right now, how you describe yourself. But where did it all start? How did you start your career?
Well, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a hairdresser. So I can probably say that was very much about helping people, but it's certainly not where I am today. Sometimes I'm lucky to get a brush through my hair these days. But, you know, from a career perspective, I started a comms law degree when I first got out of school. And as every good Aussie does, drops out 6 months later, goes and backpacks for a year and travels the world and dances on tables and has life experience. And came back, finished a degree and went into experiential marketing, and really loved that space. And so for anyone that doesn't know the term, it may be an Australian term or below the line marketing. And it's really around experiences in the hands of the consumer. So if we think about when you've been sampled something at a major event, or, you know, you get samples of fragrance in department stores, for example, that's really about connecting at a baseline with the consumer. And what I loved about that and what it really taught me was behavioral patterns and how to really connect with people, because the outcome in most cases needed to be some sort of sale or engagement. But if you actually didn't focus on the sale or the dollar amount, and you actually just leaned into the person and understood their needs and got to know a little bit more about you, you had not only the outcome in abundance, but you also had such a rich data capture of people's experiences and life, which is a privilege to have that. And so I was in experiential marketing for some time. I started my first company at 23. And I grew that, and 9 years later, I had my first exit. And we had grown that business to be one of the largest experiential companies across Australia, servicing major events like the Grand Prix, the tennis. We do a lot of the luxury branded goods in department stores as well. Post that, Fritz, I was really lost. Like I was maybe 30, if that. And I didn't really know what that next step was. And while I was privileged to get a fantastic result, you know, understanding who I was as a human was really tough at that time. And so I spent a lot of time trying to work out what my special sauce was. What was I actually bringing to the table that would be valuable? And my dad has always been in emergency response in the mining sector. And he had a very small scale RTO, which is a registered training organisation, which serves the mining communities of Australia. And I really lent into that business. And it was more around keeping myself busy at the time. But I didn't realise the gift that I would have from that business and the principles of emergency response and applying that to business was fundamentally how I have bought, grown, sold companies to this date. And those principles were all around, you know, get the facts, find out what the problem is, get a plan, get the right team around you, organize, empower the people to do their part of the puzzle, come back, do the job, come back and debrief. And at the time I was like, yeah, I didn't get the nuance of it. And that was transformational for me, because what I really learned to do was a few things. One, understand the simplification process of how you should be running businesses. Two, what it was like as a 30-year-old woman in, the early 2000s, going onto remote mine sites, predominantly male, not probably in hindsight the most open-minded or perhaps conscious of diversity and inclusion. But in saying that, I was incredibly fortunate with the experience that I had. And what it also taught me was a lot about feminine and masculine energy as a leader. And I was going into those environments thinking that I had to be everything that I wasn't. I had to be masculine and hard and one of the boys and not offended and, bad. All of these things were coming up, not because people were forcing me to be that, but because I had had it in my head that that was a male-dominated environment. This is how I had to play. And I came unstuck a number of times, and, I really was struggling. And it wasn't until I actually lent into the fact that the value that you bring isn't necessarily, what someone else has. It's what you bring. And what I brought was certainly a different approach. I gave a diverse sort of lens onto a number of problems that we had. There was the empathy and compassion, which is usually associated with feminine traits of leadership. And as soon as I actually accepted that it was okay to be a girl in a male-dominated environment, it was transformational. And it wasn't about being, female or too girly or whatever else. I could be a really badass, powerful woman in those environments. And the beautiful thing about the environments that I went into was the moment that I lent into that, all of my colleagues, all of the big leaders within mining organizations changed their view of me, and things started opening up, and it was extraordinary.
And is that something you discovered completely by your own, or did somebody just whisper in you, hey, Hayley, just be yourself. You're trying to be something you're not?
So that discussion, Fritz, came a little bit later. And I apologize. I've got a 10-month-old Pomeranian that's chewing up
Yeah.
probably something quite important. That's what he usually does. So sorry about the noise back there. Oi.
Okay.
So that actual conversation came later, Fritz. And that was when I went into the world of high net worth wealth and family offices and VC. But during the mining times, I would love to say that it was this beautiful illuminating moment where I went, right, this is what I'm going to do. There was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of egg on my face. There was tripping up, looking like an absolute dick, falling over, getting back up. So that one wasn't the most painless journey to get to the insight. And I certainly would like to have done it a lot better. But the conversation really around understanding and leaning into who I was came later.
Okay.
And it was after I was still working within the mining sector. I was doing consulting, and I was introduced to the senior managing director of the Tavistock Group. So the Tavistock Group is a $14.5 billion organisation, 9 sectors, 15 countries. And the senior managing director is just a incredible man. And I would have to say that he's probably one of the most profound mentors that I've had in my life. He has stretched me in ways that I haven't always loved, but always respected, because I knew it was coming from a very much an intention of, he knew what I could achieve. He had the confidence in me, but it was me that was the rate limiting step. And I had gone again into a very dominated male environment. I was in a field where working in agriculture for Australia's largest or oldest operating company, and a company that owns 1% of all Australian landmass. And I didn't know anything about agriculture. And, the financial side of business was never a real strength of mine. So understanding all of that, I completely froze, Fritz. It was a moment in time where I had come off this high of selling a company and then coming back in and going, what am I doing? And then having success and having these beautiful moments in the mining sector. And then all of a sudden I was back to this state where I was completely frozen with imposter syndrome. I was like, I look back and I kind of laugh because I'm like, what the hell was I doing? I was like a mad woman, like doing things that were so absurd. I'd work around the clock. I would be obsessed with perfection and, be so psychologically damaging to myself if it wasn't perfect. And I really struggled in that environment. And thank goodness for my mentor, who literally had a lot of patience, because trust me, I stretched his patience, and was fired twice. So I think my biggest fear was to get fired, and I did. I managed to do that twice. And it wasn't until the second time, and I realized that same lesson that I had in the month. It was like I'd had a lobotomy. I had this illuminating insight that was like, you were not here to be what everyone else is. You were here to bring a different dynamic. And I had really let the organization down by not being that. And so I took some time out and really thought about it and found myself and my voice and decided what I wanted to stand for. And it wasn't about ego or trying to have a title. It was really around what value can I really offer here? And as soon as I started to understand and also appreciate that, the world just got more interesting.
And you became probably more interesting to the world.
Totally. Oh, I was a lunatic. I wouldn't have even liked to have hung out with myself.
But what you're also describing to me, I find that quite interesting. You actually, in different words, describe that the whole imposter syndrome, not thinking you're good enough to do something. After a couple of times, do you recognize, oh, I'm in the imposter syndrome phase again, I'll get over that again? So does it turn into something you recognize if you experience that a couple of times? So it becomes easier to get out of that phase again?
Yeah, I'm a very data-driven person. And I think for me, it's less around me acknowledging it's an imposter syndrome, because I think because I didn't know my behavioral patterns and my freeze and flight sort of reflexes and how I dealt with fear, and what that meant and what were the behavioral patterns. I sort of feel like I term imposter syndrome at the very beginning because I didn't understand what it was. It was a syndrome. It made sense that I would have it. But as I really started to understand it a little bit more, again, it came down to the fact of me just acknowledging that I'm human, and fundamentally we all have these things when we're faced with fear or adversity. We fight, we fly, we freeze. And for me now, it is still something that happens every day. I'm human. There are moments where, and for me, it's probably more I freeze, like I'll catch myself and go, hang on a minute, because I'm so, I guess, high energy in so many ways. But I think the way that I deal with it now, Fritz, is shortening the time that I stay there.
Yes.
And actually really self-reflection and looking back and saying, why? What is it about this situation that's either a trigger, or what is it creating in me from a fear perspective that's making me freeze in this moment? And what do I need to do? And like I did a lot of work on ego, which it was fascinating for me, because we all, as good leaders, pretend we don't have one, but we all have one. And I had to really work hard at that. And it's rough when you really are committed to going deep into that. And even though the journey through it's tough, once you see glimpses of not playing in that space and not living and creating in that space, the world is a very different, incredible place.
No, fully agree. And can you now also recognize this in other people when you come across people who experience this?
Yes. And this is probably where the arrogant ego comes out of me, actually, because I think ever since I was a kid, I mentioned earlier, I was so curious about people's interactions and behavioral patterns and how people would respond, how to use language, for example, how to create psychologically safe spaces. And and all of that. So for me, I have to catch myself sometimes because I see the behavior in other people. And because I move quite fast and I like to solve problems, it can also be a hindrance because I don't give people the time, because I want to take away the pain. I want to fix the problem. I actually rip off people who need to sit in that for a little bit and find out the why and what it is for them. And so for me, I very much see it. I have to catch myself from being like, you're just in fear, you're frozen, work it out.
Yeah.
Maybe work on a little bit of the HR and empathy and conversation there. And then just give people time, because I think you get to the destination. It's just how you choose to do it. And it's your journey, right?
Yeah, I recognize that in conversation I have with people that you have to ask, do you actually want my help or not? And if you don't want that, then get back. And sometimes you realize that you're offering something people aren't ready for, aren't interested in. Okay, and then you have to accept that.
You know, Fritz, that's such a beautiful point, because I would have to say my biggest disappointment in life, as in, just in day-to-day life, is that I care so much, and I'm so like, when I love someone or when I have something that I really value and love, I throw everything at it, and I do as much as I possibly can to be in service of outcome there. And the biggest disappointment that I have is when people don't react favorably, or I feel like they don't appreciate it. And it's not because I want them to say thank you. They'll behave in a way that confuses me, or I'm like, what just happened? And I think the beautiful point that you just raised is not every problem is ours to solve. And we can love and we can support and not do anything. And it's not us that has to make that decision. And one of the techniques that I've been trying to train myself into, and when I say trying and train, I'm a work in progress. And that is, when people come to me now, particularly, so, I've got nearly 600 staff across 3 continents. And when people come to me now, I have to actually sit and consciously take a breath and say, how can I be helpful? Because my immediate thing is, I'm going to solve this for you and it's going to go away, and, then we can go to lunch.
That, yeah, reminds me of a saying my wife always says, if you want to get something done, ask a busy person.
It's so true. It's very true.
So, okay, mining industry, agricultural industry, and now you're in an industry completely different.
Yeah.
When,
Yeah. Well, I guess
why
to
did
give
you
you a
start that?
little, sorry, Fred.
Oh, why did you realize I needed to start this business?
Yeah. So, 2 of my companies, Atlas Labs and Surge, are in the technology space. And so when I was working in agriculture, my role was really around how do we think about our assets, be it land, a biological asset in cattle, and then also from a branded beef perspective. And what does that look like across the visibility of the supply chain? How do we collect data? How do we use technology to drive insight? And so my remit of coming into the role as an executive was, how do we get better insights by using technology to enable them? And so being curious and a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit, rather than employing in or getting third parties, I built out a strategy to build our end-to-end data play. So what that looked like from a engineering and IoT perspective, how do we collect data? How do we architect it? How do we drive insight through, and it makes me laugh now because we were talking about sort of machine learning and AI 10 years ago as well. And then how do we push to consumer? So I bought 2 companies with the group in Australia, and ended up moving to Sri Lanka for 4 years and bought another 2 businesses there. So we had the end-to-end capabilities. And so that really taught me the nuances of solving the problem end to end, getting the visibility and getting the insight. But I didn't really know tech. And, I know tech as a function and a utility. I'm not a coder. I'm not incredibly clever in the space, but I have incredible team members around me. So, you know, for the last 8 years, most of my career has been heavily within the technology or performance marketing space. And so through that journey, I became really fascinated with the power of emerging technology and also the waves of the web. So if you think about in its most simplistic, Web 1 was all about consuming in a non-interactive way. Web 2 moved us into the social sphere of interaction, a push and a pull. And Web 3, the way I like to articulate it in its most simplistic, is read, write, own. And what I mean by that is it's really all around ownership, choosing your own adventure, and engaging and creating community and community growth to achieve goals. And to be able to do that with authenticity, integrity, visibility, and credibility is really the basis principles of blockchain, if you think of it when it's used for good. You know, secure ledgers, ways in which we can have smart contracts, we can have visibility, there's a ledger that everyone can access. And I became fascinated by it. And because I have always loved this concept of evening the playing field, whether that be through the investment strategies I've created for organizations, for, you know, founders and startups to raise capital where they're not heavily diluted, particularly in early stage rounds, or the thing that where I'll lead into with Women Making Waves and Waves Tech is around gender diversity and minority groups. Like, how do we even the playing field? And fundamentally, I believe that it's through education and access. How do we create access to education in a way that empowers? And how do we do it in a way that it's not only for the privileged? You know, there is billions of people on this world and not everyone has that same privilege. So how do we start thinking about it? And so just as COVID hit, I was on the last flight back to New York thinking I was coming to Australia for 3 weeks. And 3 years later, I didn't leave the country. And during that time, I met my now business partner in Women Making Waves. And for those that haven't heard, Women Making Waves is essentially a social enterprise solving the problem of gender rights law reform by funding charities who work predominantly in this space. And being entrepreneurs and not knowing the charity space, we really applied a principle that I picked up through an amazing book called Who Not How by Dan Sullivan. So if you want a good book to read through, the principles is really around finding your who's instead of asking yourself how. And so the principle was all around, well, if I want to get to the source of the problem of gender equality, if I want to really think about how I can contribute, then managing the symptoms is actually not going to be the fastest and most effective way to do that. We need to go back all the way into the frameworks and the governance of what we're governed by. And that's, you know, in this case, our law system, our legal system, our frameworks that are in Australia were created 200 years ago, where women couldn't vote. Women were certainly not even included on the count on the census. If you wanted to open a bank account, you couldn't do that unless you had a very, very eligible, lovely gentleman that would do it for you. And what I was always perplexed by is, if we're starting on the back foot, how can we really ever make fundamental change? And so there are a number of organizations around this world that work specifically in the area of gender rights law reform. And yet, like all charities, they've got the other issue of most of their time is actually not doing the work where they have the greatest impact. It's fundraising. And so what the problem we wanted to solve was, one, fundamentally, we wanted to change laws. Two, and we wanted to create reoccurring and sustainable revenue streams for charities so that if they didn't have to worry about that, how much faster and how much more effective could they be at the incredible things that they do. So we created Women Making Waves. It was a 10,000 piece NFT collection at the very beginning, based around 5 characters. It's a very sort of Gen Z millennial brand. Because one of my biggest missions in life is always to bring a new demographic, a younger demographic, to philanthropic giving and how we think about distribution of wealth. And so it started as a NFT collection, and I learned a lot, because anyone that wants to launch a 10,000 piece collection when the crypto winter hits, come and see me, and I'll tell you all of the ugly side of it, because it was tough. But one of the things that we were determined to do was, as most entrepreneurs, you are resilient. And so we pivoted and really thought about the utility of emerging technology. We created amazing experiences, both digitally and in person. We sold digital memberships so that people could attend live events, as well as 50% of their membership each year goes into an impacts fund, where we fund our impact partners. To date, our impact partners have actually changed 45 laws across Australia and the US in the last 2 years, all relating to gender rights, the right to speak up against perpetrators, sexual harassment in the workplace. And from that work, not only have we been able to change the laws and fund charities who know how to do them, we also created a corporate offer which allowed organizations to really lean in and go, well, this is a problem. This is a sexual harassment in workplaces is a problem, and let's not always put a negative lens for the fix. And what I mean by that is, we go in with this fear-based energy around education. What if we actually changed our culture and thought about it as a growth driver, and thought about what's acceptable and not, and be really, really firm on what we stand for and what we stand with? And so one of our campaigns was a campaign called I Took the Pledge, where we had a VC organization across the world every 10 minutes posting their pledge with Women Making Waves to stand with us and create a zero tolerance culture for sexual harassment in workplaces, and to continue the work and the education that we were doing. So it was really great.
And making an assumption here, is that also the reason why you were nominated for the Entrepreneur of the Year award by the CEO Global magazines?
Yeah, it was one of them. And I was very privileged. And I didn't win, by the way, but I was a finalist, and a very good friend of mine actually won. But that was one of the reasons. And I think the fact that, because of my journey coming from a small town in Wollongong, immigrant parents, my mum's German, my dad's English, and really not coming from privilege as such within a business world. I think from falling and fumbling my way through my first company, then going into a very male-dominated industry and creating a hybrid approach which solved a massive problem for mine sites, not just from a safety perspective, but business optimization and downtime cost savings. And then when I went into the Tavistock Group, to go into agriculture and then come out the back of it with 4 tech companies and living in Sri Lanka. And then from that, creating a real brand for myself, which was all based on the values of what I wanted to do. And that was, to use what I know, my voice and my privilege, to cause change for good and empower people to do what they need to do. And I think that was more sort of the story of it, rather than perhaps maybe having a 20x multiplier on an exit.
Hayley, you've shared a fascinating life and an obvious, I would say, business success. But does the business success also equate to personal success? If yes, okay. If no, what's the difference? And what is it to you?
Yeah. And again, such a wonderful question, and thank you for asking. The answer is simply no, it doesn't. So I like to think of life as in, there's no such thing as a business life and a personal life, because we're humans, and it's just how you spend your time and, who you show up to when you go to work if you go to work, should be the same person with the same values that you are at home. And I learned the hard way that that's not the way I was living. And so while my career in many ways has had highs and lows, and, you know, I think it's very kind you haven't asked me of all the fuck ups, and I apologize if I'm not allowed to swear, but yeah, I think the beauty of being an entrepreneur is there's probably more screw ups than there are highs, but we only usually talk about the highs. But from a personal perspective, that's probably been the thing that's taken the biggest hit. And because I was so obsessed with creating and really leaning in and finding out how to solve these problems, it's cost me a lot of great relationships. And probably if you ask the people that were in the relationship with me, I don't know if they'd define it as great at the time. I was married and divorced 4 years later. And I think the other side effect for me is I had to learn the hard way after 3 burnouts, some significant health considerations, that it has to be a holistic approach. And what I was doing was I didn't understand that, and I didn't understand the connection. And this is where I work a lot with businesses now, is we talk about longevity, well-being, the holistic approach. And I was like, but hang on, from a business thing, I've got it sorted. Even though I was in the wellness space in some instances, I was an ex-CrossFitter, I was running half marathons, I didn't realize that all of that were actually limiting my ability to make clear decisions because of energetic fields. How I was making decisions when I was tired or sleep deprived, how I was reacting. I can honestly say, Fritz, has been some of the worst moments in my business and my personal career have all been interconnected because of that. And I had to learn the hard way. I had to lose a husband and a job and my health. And I had a beautiful broken cheek as I fell into oncoming traffic in Colombo as I collapsed after my 3rd burnout. So again, I think it's taken me probably longer than most to work it out. And so now in the last year, that's something that's really been a focus for me.
I must
Particularly,
confess that during the interview, I would say the bumpy road, the failures, they were implied in your story, to be honest. So they
yeah,
were already in there.
yeah.
Couple of questions at the end because time is moving so fast, but it's fascinating to listen to you talk about what you've done so far.
You should have put a time limit on me, Fritz. Sorry.
Oh no, we're not going to do that if the story is interesting. Then we just keep on rolling. Question was, some people would argue that okay, I have my ambition, and with my ambition comes sacrifice, and I accept sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that's one way to look at it. Said, hey, I don't care about that. But I'm hearing you do caring about. You could say,
Yeah.
fact you had to make.
Well, and it's really interesting, the language of and using the word of sacrifice. And again, a great question, because I actually fundamentally don't believe that. And I believe that every single person on this planet can have, if they're honest with themselves, and it's not all about, you know, a super yacht in the Bahamas or something. You know, I believe that we can have it all. It's about choice. And it's about how we value different areas and how we spend our time. And once you get that balance, then I think the decisions and the choices are really super easy. And it's not a sacrifice. For me, I am working on the balance.
Yeah, it's something I've come to realize over time that I can always re-earn the money I've lost. I can never re-earn the time I've lost. So I want to focus on where I'm going to spend my time on.
Yeah, and I love that, because for me, time is my currency. And so it was one of the things that I was probably always destined to be an entrepreneur, because the whole concept of having to go to an office, like I would work 20-hour days, but if someone said I had to go 9 to 5 somewhere, that would be absurd. You know, and I think time is so important. And you're right, it's not something we can get back. And how you choose to spend your time is the most valuable decision you can make. And, through my experiences, I've had to really look at how I give out my time, how I savor my own time for myself, because even though most people would absolutely say I'm an extrovert, I'm actually really introverted, and I need the time at the end of the day to actually be reflective and really thoughtful and quiet. And the other thing is, I had to do a really interesting, I forced myself to do an interesting exercise, which was a time value matrix. And I don't know if you've done one, Fritz, or anyone that's listening, but it was so profound because it's your normal sort of matrix where, time and value, high, low, low. And what I realized was in the moments where I was coming stuck in multiple areas of my life, I was all in the bottom right quadrant. And that was, all of the efforts that I was putting in was low value and a low outcome, and it was costing me a lot of time, and which was having a massive flow effect into every decision I made personally and professionally. And so I've kind of done a detox on a lot of things in my life. So how I spend my time, who I spend my time with now, I think is really important, because I think you can get very much involved in toxic situations where you get disempowered, and then you lose the opportunity to make those clear decisions.
Hey, Hayley, you've actually implicitly already answered my final question. And by the way, I'm quite honored that you've been willing to spend a little bit of your time, precious time, with a brand called you. But outside the time factor, is there anything else you would like to give young people starting their own journey out there? What would you tell to those young people? What would you tell your younger self to do?
When fall in love with the problem, the moment you start focusing on the outcome, for example, of money, or you take your focus off the things that matter, that are ultimately the growth driver that's going to get you there. So I would say fall in love with the problem, understand yourself. And it's really difficult as a young leader, because there's so much noise in the world around what we should and shouldn't be, and what we should be following, and how we should be doing it. And I think if I could give myself some advice, I would be take the time to learn you and listen to your tummy. Intuition is such a powerful thing, and we often ignore it because our logical brain comes in and tells us that we need to be doing something different. And so really leaning into feeling whatever you're feeling and sitting with it, and then deciding to push through. And I think resilience is a massive thing. And for every no you get, there is a yes out there. It may not be the yes that you think you're going to get for the right reason that you want, but the one thing that I've learned is the universe will always place you where you need to be.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.